Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this ACT series for secondary teachers. This is going to be a four-part installment of a webinar that discusses the ACT English and reading portions of the ACT subtest. So to start off with, let's go over some of our objectives. We're going to develop an understanding for the basics of the ACT reading and English test. We're going to develop an understanding of the purpose and implications of the ACT reading test today, specifically on student achievement. And we're going to draw some correlations between the skills that are needed to be successful on the ACT reading test and the skills that good readers already possess. So thank you for taking your time for joining us today. Like I said, this will be a multi-part series that will go over both the reading and the English portions of the ACT. As you know, the ACT is a college readiness test that is meant to be one measure of a student's college readiness. Not only do the scores on this test grant students admission into post-high school institutions, but they are also the key to getting our students some financial aid in the form of scholarships, including TOPS. But in Louisiana, many students are not performing at the benchmark that is set by the ACT to indicate college readiness in all the different subtest areas. So this series will explore the basics of the reading and English test, as well as some of the ways to incorporate preparing students for the ACT while using some high quality instructional materials, which you should already be using within your classrooms through your Tier 1 curriculums. Today's focus specifically will be on just the basics of what is on the reading subtest and how it relates to literacy in your classrooms. And I want you to just keep in mind that this is something that all secondary teachers of literacy can and really should be incorporating in their regular instruction as it is. However, students are really better prepared to receive information when they are aware of the purpose of what they are doing in their classroom. So when you are noticing that you're encountering an area in your curriculum or a spot in the lesson where you can also highlight this as highlight an ACT skill in your instruction, make sure that you communicate that to your students as well so that they know that this is important for more than just this lesson, for more than just their end of unit assessment. They'll need it on the ACT. There's a purpose for why we're learning those strategies that you're pointing out to them. So it's really important that we start embedding these skills as early as we can in our classrooms so that they have all of these tools when they go to take this test. And it's also important to keep in mind that even the students who are not planning to go to a four-year college are going to take this test as well. And while it doesn't have as much of an impact on where they go to school, if they're considering a two-year or a trade school, it can still be used for scholarships and TOPS money for students who are not four-year college bound as well. So it's something that is useful to them as well. And a lot of times they just need to be informed of how it is useful. So let's talk about the reading subtest today and just the basics of what is on it. So it's actually the third test of a four-part exam on the ACT. The first part is English, the second is math, then you have your reading, and then science. This reading subtest is it's always 40 questions, and students are given 35 minutes to complete it. It's important that you know what types of passages are going to be on there, as well as the types of questions that your students are going to be asked about these passages. So as far as passages go, there will always be 4 passages. There will always be 1 prose fiction, and then there will be always 3 nonfiction passages. 1 will be about a social studies topic, 1 will be about a humanities topic, and 1 will be a natural sciences passage as well. They usually kind of appear on the test in the same order that's on the screen. There can be some slight deviations, but in general, they appear in that order. Also, one of the 4 passages, and it can change on every test. It can be the first passage, second, third, or fourth. It doesn't have to stay the same, but one of them will be what is called a paired passage, which just means that there is a section A and a section B on that passage, where section A is a separate passage from passage B about related topics. And then the questions will have some questions about passage A, some about passage B, and then some about both passages combined, where they'll have to synthesize the information that they have read. One newer feature to the ACT reading test that is not super common yet, but ACT has said is coming, is they're calling it VQI, which is where they have a paired passage, but it's a passage paired with a visual, whether it's a map or a chart or a graph, etc. Again, not really common yet, but it is kind of coming down the pipeline. So something to just keep in mind if you are dealing with any HQIM where students are having to synthesize information between written, written passages and something like a map or a chart. and just synthesizing how those two things are related. The biggest struggle that most students are going to face on this test is how fast they have to work. 35 minutes is a very tight squeeze for most of our readers, even our good readers. But the good news is the skills that they need to do well on this test are things that we can and we really should already be explicitly teaching through HQIN. The timing is something that you can practice separately from what you're doing in your curriculum with time practice. There's a time and a place for that, but also equipping these students for what to expect on the test in terms of both skills and approaches to reading quickly and the types of passages as well as the types of questions that they're going to be asked is going to be an invaluable tool to their success. And then lastly, it's important to know the benchmark score for this. So it's a 22. The highest you can make on any subtest or on a composite is a 36. And for ACT on the reading test, they say that a 22 means students are college ready. Which, speaking about benchmarks, this chart is pulled from some research that was posted to ACT.org that just highlights what the scores on various subtests translates to in terms of college readiness. So you'll notice that students' ability to perform well on the reading portion of the test is typically correlated with success and readiness for social studies and humanities-based courses in college. If you look at the very bottom of the chart, you'll see that there's an ELA category. So this is the combined score of English and reading, the average of those two sections, and the types of courses that they correlate to after high school as well. It's important to note that a lot of universities will look at their composite scores, but they will also look at students' English and math scores in isolation to see if they've reached those benchmarks. If students are below benchmark score for English and or math, they will sometimes determine that students will need remedial courses, or they will tell them they're not admitted until they have taken a remedial course. So just to keep in mind, that is a way for the students to even save money because they don't have to pay for those remedial courses and spend a semester in those remedial courses if they come to college with these scores already. But each university does have their own policies for this, and they're usually pretty easily accessible on the admissions portions of their websites. And then just this graph was pulled also from the same research that the previous chart was pulled from as well. If you notice, students who achieve benchmark in all 4 subtests, they tended to have a higher likelihood of completing their associate's or their bachelor's program within a given set time. This further speaks to the idea that this test is aligned to college readiness standards. And of course, this does not mean that every student who isn't at benchmark or above on each subtest can't or won't finish their college degree programs. There is just some data that supports that there is a strong correlation between the students who do have their benchmark scores when they are in high school and their chances of completing their degree programs after, because they are technically what ACT would call college ready. So another quick note, this is not research. This is at the back of any ACT release practice test. It's the score chart. And it's just a chart that translates whatever the raw score is or however many questions a student got correct on any subtest and what that translates to for their scaled score out of 36. I like to show students this because it's important for them to see that they don't need to be perfect on this test to be able to reach that benchmark score. Just on the reading test alone on this one, they only need to get 24 of the 40 questions right to make a 22. You can't use just this chart. Like this chart is from, I believe, an April 2021 test. There are some slight variations and fluctuations in how many questions correlate to whatever scale score you're looking for. So make sure you check the score chart for whatever specific test you may be working with students on. But it is within a few questions usually. So they don't need to be perfect to show that they're college ready on these tests. And then this other chart that you'll see at the end of any ACT test is there'll be several of these actually for each of the subtests, and it's the scoring key. What's important about these is that you'll see that there are reporting categories. On this one, it says KID, Key Ideas and Details, CS for Craft and Structure, and ICKY for Integration of Knowledge and Ideas. These reporting categories are important, and it's kind of what we'll be focusing on next, as they can help to indicate which skills to use to answer questions, as well as how to incorporate these skills into your regular instruction. But before we do that, let's move on to the actual skills of the test and how it relates to the reading and literacy instruction that should already be happening in our classrooms with the use of our Tier 1 curriculums and our HQIM. So this next portion is going to be very much geared towards how to embed well, really, what are the ACT skills, and then a brief overview of how they can be embedded into our regular practice. In part 2, we'll go over a lot more in depth the application portion of this test within our instruction. So you may or may not already be familiar with these reader circles, but there are two, one for literary text and one for informational text. And these are used heavily in guidebooks curriculum to show basically the progression that students go through as they are reading or doing multiple readings of a text to get to this analysis piece down here. So as we go through these question types, I just want you to consider where on the reader circle they might fall when you're working with complex text in your classroom. Because the idea is you can use the text that you're already using in your classroom to highlight the ACT skills that they may need. So these circles are designed to model how students will progress through a text to get to analysis. And you'll notice that the categories here are also present on the ACT. We're going to kind of show the comparison as we go through it. So ACT is not asking for students to perform mastery of some foreign skills that they're never exposed to in the classroom if you're embedding them in your already established curriculums. And this is just highlighting, as you see in the bottom, it's a continuum that students go from observation and they move through these different circles to get all the way to the big portion of meaning, where you kind of look at central idea, theme, perspective, purpose, all of those things. And then they just kind of start here in our author's craft, where you'll have to, these are the different kind of components that make up author's craft. It's a lot of times what they might notice upon first read, or maybe first or second read of a piece. And then they move through these different cones or these different circles as they continue to analyze the piece for further need. So our very first category that we're going to look at is key ideas and details, or the abbreviation is KID. Again, there are 3 reporting categories. This one is the largest category. It makes up anywhere from 20 to 24 questions on any of the tests that the students will take. So half, if not more, of the questions on a test. The good news is that this is not only the easiest category for us to teach, because it is all over in our curriculums, but that it is also embedded into the curriculum we use. We just need to make sure that we can explicitly teach these as both skills good readers have and skills that students will need on the test as well. Another important thing about this category is that any question that students can counter from it will be something that is either directly stated in the text or it is very closely paraphrased to what is directly in the text. So they'll notice like the answer choices are verbatim stuff in the text. So they know to go and look at those sections and see which is the most appropriate answer for that question. So they don't have to kind of make a whole lot of guessing and paraphrasing when it's done for them in the question answers. So within this category, there are 3 subtypes, not as important for your students to know, but explicit details, inferences, and then main idea and summary are the 3 subtypes of this reporting category. Each of these terms should sound pretty familiar for teachers of literacy, as these are all things that we often ask students to do with text that they are reading in our classrooms. So, and if you note at the bottom row of the chart of the questions are the stems that are used on the ACT to indicate to you or to a test taker that these questions are key idea and detail questions and that the answer can be pretty explicitly found in the text. These question stems make it very easy also for you as the teacher to incorporate questions that on topics you might already be addressing about the text with your students, but just wording them in the style of the ACT. So, and I used to give my kids these question stems and let them see them so they would know, like, oh, if I see the passage states or indicates, I know that I'm looking at something that's explicitly in the text, or if I see based on the passage. So it's important for them to have exposure to this as well. And it's important for you to know this so that you can make questions for you that are text dependent, basically, but using these stems for your instruction. So what does this look like on the actual test? On the left side is an image that has 4 different key idea and detail questions from the released ACT 2021 test. And you'll note that every single one of them begins with one of the question stems that are on the previous slide. And while the obvious tip is to formulate text-dependent questions modeled after these, there are other options that you can use to help incorporate these skills in your classroom as well. So if you look up on the screen, you'll see things like practicing circling or underlining or just annotating the text to indicate main idea. That's something that you can talk about in your class and have a set kind of routine for how to annotate for that. Making note of key details, even talking about the difference between key details versus main idea. A lot of times kids need some explicit instruction in the difference between the two. Identifying major claims in a text. This is something that I know in pretty much every curriculum that I've looked at, students have to do very regularly, and they also have to write their own claims. So this is a kind of a double whammy where you can talk about what is a good claim and how do I know in the text where the claims are. Writing short summary sentences at the end of paragraphs or sections of text. This is something that they would definitely have to practice before doing on a time test, and they'd have to practice it frequently. But students need to be able to write summaries effectively, and this can help them kind of go back and find things in the text if they know what paragraph talked about what topic. Kind of on the same vein, just statements and discussing sequence and chronology is important a lot of times on this test. The ACT has been famous for asking students for chronology, but like not always like in a very basic, like what happened first, then what happened next. They'll kind of ask it in a roundabout way, but students need to be able to identify what order things happened in according to the passage. And then drawing conclusions from the text as well, which again, all of these things are things that you should be familiar with from your own instruction. So coming up with your own systems for annotation, super helpful if you kind of gear them towards what they're going to have to do on the ACT as well as in the text that you're teaching them. But just remember that like any new concept that's introduced into a classroom, appropriate direct instruction, modeling, and scaffolding is going to have to be done to ensure that the students understand how to annotate or do whatever the skill is correctly. And be able to answer these types of questions independently eventually. So you don't have to limit yourself to just annotating the text, but you could also use this as an opportunity to teach annotation. I also think this could be a good opportunity for you to use these skills and these types of skills to have some small discussions in your classroom as well. And then eventually lead that up to you being able to ask questions that are framed with these question stems. Whoops, my bad. So looking back at the reader circle, key idea and detail questions fit into, as far as on the literary text side to the left, author's craft with details and imagery. In elements and structure, they're looking at things like plot and setting a lot of times, which are basically details. And then they're also looking in the meaning section many times for things like central idea and theme. As far as informational texts go, it's very similar with author's craft being details and imagery, and then for purpose and perspective, again, with central idea. So just to show you that like these things do align with the skills and the parts or elements of literature that you're going to be looking at in class as well. On to our second reporting category, craft and structure. This makes up anywhere from 10 to 12 questions on the test, so it's the second largest category. These questions will specifically ask about things like vocabulary and context and text structure, as well as purpose, point of view, and the function of specific parts of the text. So, or even the text as a whole, but a lot of times like the function of a specific paragraph is going to be a question that they're asked, or author's purpose is basically what that is. The above, or like the question stems on your screen, are the ones that would be used by ACT for these types of questions for this reporting category. So that can help you in planning to embed your ACT instruction by knowing that like, oh, we're going to be talking about some vocabulary in this lesson anyway. Let's talk about how can I teach some vocabulary and context skills here. Or we're already gonna have to talk about a bunch of things that have to do with author's purpose. So how can I incorporate an ACT type skill here as well? Remember, letting kids see the stems and learn the types of skills that those stems are asking them to do is going to help them make better connections when you point out these skills in your instruction as well. So again, the more information they have, the better off they will be. We don't want this test to be a big surprise to them when we have the tools right here to be able to show them what to expect. On the actual ACT, these are some examples to the left of what the questions will look like. You'll note that they're all consistent with the stems on the previous slide. And as stated earlier, while there is a time and place for some timed isolated ACT practice, that is not something that you always have a ton of time to focus on. So let's utilize the time that we do have and the instructional material that we do have to kind of leverage that to make sure students get to practice those skills frequently and with different texts as well. So utilizing these skills within texts that are required in our HQIM is, for many of us, the most efficient way to prepare them for the ACT. Not to mention, these are skills that make a good reader. So vocabulary and context is something that students need to know how to do to be good readers in a variety of settings. There's a resource that is going to be on our literacy library as well as Canopy that discusses further how to teach vocabulary and context. And then your Tier 1 curriculums already ask students to answer questions regarding text structure and purpose frequently. So students can work with various text structures in class that will lend themselves to discussions about how structure impacts meaning or how an author would choose to structure text in a specific way. And this would include the use of transitional words or phrases that are used to indicate structure in a text. Not only is that something that they need to be aware of as readers, but it will help them in both their own writing and on the English portion of the ACT, which we'll see in a few installments from this webinar. So just to keep that in mind, this is very multifaceted. It's going to work for many different purposes. And then referring back to our reader circles, craft and structure for literary text fits into author's craft with word choice and connotation and sentence structure and figurative language. Elements in structure is tone, point of view, and pacing. And then with literary effects, symbolism and mood, and finally with meaning, perspective, and purpose. And then for our informational text in author's craft, word choice, connotation, sentence structure, figurative language again. For the development component, organization, structure, speaker, tone, and then purpose and perspective with central idea and with a purpose as well. So, and then we have our very last reporting category. It's integration of knowledge and ideas, but the abbreviation spells ICKY. This makes up the smallest portion of the test questions, usually somewhere between 6 and 9. I have seen where it's a few less than like 4 or 5, and like one of the other ones has more questions, but general rule of thumb is 6 to 9 questions. And they're often found many times on the paired passages. They can be other places, but the paired passages where students need to synthesize 2 different texts. So it makes sense that this is where these questions will show. These question stems are great because they really lend themselves to both paper pencil format questioning, but also you can turn these questions into group discussion and class discussions about texts as well. They're often kind of higher order thinking compared to some of the other ones. So students will likely need a strong understanding of the text before they can really do these, before diving straight into a synthesis question. So make sure you kind of appropriately scaffolded, but these are questions that you can definitely use to guide discussions as well as just provide them with some paper pencil test questions as well. So you have some options here. These question stems are not as cut and dry as the others. Questions specifically referring to both passages. So like it'll say according to both passage A and B, XYZ. So while it's harder to maybe formulate these questions, it is more about you being able to get kids to synthesize information from multiple sources, or understanding claims that are made in a text and how those claims are supported, which is, again, stuff that we do with the reading that we're doing in class anyway, and stuff that we expect kids to do with their own writing as well. Just to give you an example of what these may look like on the test, just so you can see maybe a couple of stems. This is for some synthesis questions on a paired passage from a Release 2021 test. If you look at the top, it always tells them as well in a little box, like it says 28 through 30, asks about both passages. That's kind of another tip off that they should know. It's ICKY, or integration of knowledge and ideas. So, but if you have some careful planning of these texts within your Tier 1 curriculum, it's going to allow you to create some text-dependent questions that assess these types of skills. And you can do this with your print materials and your visual materials as well. So it kind of also will cover the VQI, or the visual paired passages that are coming. So remember, the goal is to have students see how these skills translate to the test, not necessarily always giving them practice tests and hoping that if I just give them enough practice tests, they're going to get better at it. We want to show them how it's applicable, and then in reverse, take that application and use it on the test as well. And that way, when the time for the test comes, this is easy peasy. They've done it a million times in class. They know that this is not new skills. They can do it on their own. And just lastly, so we can make sure this fits in all the boxes, or in all the different circles as well, The integration of knowledge and ideas for literary text fits into author's craft for connotation, literary devices, and imagery. Elements and structure would be tone and point of view. Meaning, we're looking at central idea, theme, perspective, and all of them. And then for informational text, development and structure, looking at evidence to help support claims. And then purpose and perspective, where we look at central idea. And then I always want to make sure that we are in highlighting and embedding. I said earlier that these are skills that good readers have, not just skills for kids who are good at the ACT. And all the skills that we discussed in this presentation exist on Scarborough's reading rope, which is the rope that shows us what all the skills are that make up a good reader. In the language comprehension strands, so all these red strands that you see at the top, that is where most of our secondary students, or most of our secondary teachers, are focusing with our students. And almost every single one of those strands exists and is assessed on the ACT, and it is in your instruction. The key idea and detail questions address components of the language structures, verbal reasoning, knowledge language strands, and then the craft and structure questions address vocabulary, language structure, and literacy knowledge. And lastly, the integration of knowledge and idea questions address verbal reasoning and language structure as well. You might have noticed that background knowledge was not explicitly listed as a connection. That's purposeful. It's because this is kind of an ACT policy that they want to make sure, in the name of equity, that their passages don't utilize a lot of background knowledge. So this could be an advantage to some students. It's subjective by student. So they do their very best to select passages that are easily accessible in terms of background knowledge to most, if not all, students whenever they go to take the test. But otherwise, the skills assessed on this test are very clearly represented in many of the strands on this rope, and that it takes to create a skilled reader. And it's why it's considered a way to assess college readiness, because if you can do these things on this test, that means that you also can do all the different skills on this strand, which represents students who are strong readers. Okay, so looking ahead, I just first of all want to thank you for taking the time out to participate in this session. I hope you were able to get some useful information. In our next session, we'll be looking at more specific ways to apply the information in this session to your HQIM. I will be specifically working with a guidebooks example, but if you don't teach guidebooks, you can still mimic the process that I'm going to show you. So please don't let that be a reason for you not to hop on. In the meantime, I encourage you to try to find some ways to begin incorporating those skills into your curriculum. Get creative. And if you have any questions or would like some further support on this, please feel free to contact us at louisianaliteracy@la.gov. Have a great day.